If you and me were sitting across each other right now, maybe with a cup of coffee or tea in a hand, I'd be curious about how you talk about yourself. Not necessarily what you say out loud in meetings, but the inner monologue, the voice that kicks in when you're tired or after you've been challenged, or just before you hit send on that something that feels a bit too bold. What do you call yourself then? And out of curiosity, where did that come from?
Confidence starts inside of you.
Right now, I am in a lot of processes of thinking on where I will focus going forward. And in that process, it's also coming up some stories in me that maybe I have been talking to myself about that I need to change a bit or adjust in some way. Some stories is there for helping me, but others may be holding me back in some way. And during one of those talks, discussions I have had during this week, I come to think about one of those stories that I have been telling for myself for a long time. So let me take you back a bit. When I first entered the workplace after finishing my university studies, I had a clear memory of excitement mixed with a quiet panic. I had studied math and science since I wanted to become that engineer. And now I was stepping into a software development company. Well, that felt familiar and also exciting. But there was a twist. The company built financial systems to support the debt collection processes. And within finance, well, I had really limited knowledge, and especially in the debt collection process. And a fun fact, or maybe a slightly embarrassing one, is that during the job interview, I was asked if I knew how to do bookkeeping, debit and credit, the basics. And I had answered semi honestly, well, I have taken a course on it, which was technically true, but I didn't say was that, well, I hadn't actually completed it. So I made a quiet promise to myself at that point that during the next 6 weeks before the job started, I would catch up. I would go back to those books and fill in the gaps. But there is a big difference between understanding a concept in a textbook and being handed the responsibility in a real meeting with real people and real numbers on the line. I didn't have the language for it back then, but deep inside, I felt like I had snuck in through a side door, like everyone was already in the room for a reason, and I was just hoping nobody would notice I hadn't been trained for it. That's when I quietly started labeling myself as junior, not on LinkedIn, not in my title, but in my head. I was junior, which meant I could be unsure, I could wobble, I could ask silly questions, I could try things, fall and try again. And that was actually helpful for a while. It made space for learning. I was open, I was curious, and brave in many ways. But here's where it gets tricky. That label stayed with me far beyond the expiry date. Even after I had taken my first leadership role, even after I was trusted to lead teams and projects that matter, and even when I was sitting around at tables with very senior professionals, I still quietly saw myself as the one who hadn't really studied the right things or didn't have the same credentials. And I want to say clearly, I was delivering. I was being trusted. I was being invited into those spaces because what I brought in, not because of someone felt sorry for me. But I wasn't letting that trust land on the inside of me because I was still using an internal scripts that said, You're still figuring it out. You're not as qualified as them. You're the junior. Looking back, it's no surprise that I often worked a bit harder, prepared a bit longer, said yes to a bit too much, because I was trying to compensate for a story I hadn't challenged yet. Still, after 15 years, after leaving the university world, it was still there. But then I had led teams, held senior positions, built trust with colleagues and clients across industries. I had also started getting curious about my own next step, not just in work, but how I saw myself. So I reached out to a mentor, someone whose opinion I respected and who I knew would ask better questions than I was asking myself, and especially listen. We talked a few times. I shared some of my work and my experiences where I felt strong and where I felt unsure. And one day he just looked at me kindly but rather direct and said, "Why do you keep calling yourself junior?" I froze because in that moment I realized I had said it again without thinking, almost like a reflex, as it was just a fact. But it wasn't. It was an old label that I had become a habit. He asked me, "What exactly are you comparing yourself to?" When I tried to answer, I realized how shaking my reference points were. I was comparing myself to men in 15 to 20 years older than me, with MBAs, with long corporate CVs. People who had studied finance and business from day one, while I had taken a different path. But that didn't mean I was junior. It just meant I was bringing something else to the table, a different view, a different perspective. My mentor, he then started describing how he saw me through his lens, which was based in my actual field, in my actual experience. And he painted a picture that was completely different from mine. That landed like a splash of cold water in a best way. Suddenly, I saw that I wasn't young and promising. I was seasoned. I had been through things, learned things, built things, and that mattered. He didn't try to cheerlead or flatter me. He just held up a mirror and asked me to choose. Do you want to keep telling that old story, or is it time for a new one? Today, I run my own business. I work with leaders who are thoughtful, driven, and deeply human. But that voice, it still shows up sometimes, especially in the world of entrepreneurship, where there are so many ways to compare. Compare followers, revenues, clients, offers, impact. Yeah, the list can go on. That's why I return to my reflection practice day by day to remember who I am, what matters, and what success looks like for me. For me, success is being in a place where I can contribute and be myself while doing it. That gives me the joy and sparkling smile. A friend of mine, her name is Annika Teleus, says that she measures success in goosebumps. I just love that measuring point. This episode isn't here to give you answers. It's an invitation to get curious about how you speak to yourself, about the titles or stories you carry that might be outdated, about the quiet labels you've been repeating for years, maybe without even noticing, and maybe, just maybe, to consider that might shift it to something that helps you to see yourself through a different lens. That's what I experienced with my mentor. And for you, it might be a coach, a mentor, or a good friend. That's someone who sees your strength and holds up a different type of mirror. Not because anything's wrong with you, but because you're curious, because there's more to discover, more of you to discover. If you have been following this podcast, you know I'm walking through a framework called the Confident Framework. Each letter represents a part of the journey towards sustainable, confident leadership. And even though today's episode isn't formally about one of those steps, this story actually touches three of them. First of all, it's empathy, because the way we speak to ourselves matters. It takes courage and compassion to pause and listen to your own self talk with kindness. The other part is ownership, because noticing the story is the first step. But then comes the choice. Do I keep repeating it, or do I take responsibility for shaping a new one? And the third one is truth, because eventually we all reach to a point where the old version of ourselves doesn't fit anymore. And in that moment, we're invited to ask, what is actually true for me now? So, no, this isn't a classic leadership tip or tool you can plug into your calendar. It's just a continuous curiosity on compared to what? Is that what I want to compare myself with? And if needed, have the courage to act on change. It's part of what's make confident leadership possible, the kind that comes from within. The story I tell myself today is grounded in curiosity and growth. I choose to keep learning, to show up in my full colors, and to take my place at the table, knowing I bring something valuable. Not to outshine or override anyone else, but to contribute, to complement, and to add that extra spark where I am. So if you're wondering whether coaching might be something for you, you're welcome to reach out. Let's have a conversation. We look at what you want and what's important to you, and whether I'm the right person to support you. Until then, be kind with your words, not just the ones that you say to others, but, and I say this with extra empathy, the ones you say to yourself. You're probably far more experienced than you give yourself credit for. And the story you tell yourself, well, that's allowed to change. Stay true to who you truly are. Showcase your colors, not to outshine or override anyone else, but to complement. Because when we each lead from our own palette, the whole picture becomes richer.
This kind of leadership sets you apart. Bright and brave in every hue. Confidence starts inside of you.